Hi, everybody. Welcome to the monthly show here. And what I'd like to do is begin, as I always do, talking a little bit about what what the show's about. I began it several years ago, and the idea was to encourage people to analyze their own games. And if you go back in the chess.com forums, you can find many annotated games through the years of a very high quality. And what I am especially proud of is that you can see several players who've created a habit of submitting a game every month, that their annotations have gotten better. And that ability to think about chess, which you get from analyzing your own games, comes through in those annotations. And a key art about annotating your own games is that you have a personal relationship to the moves that you played. So it's very interesting to go over other people's games, classical games, and that's all very important, especially for expanding your conceptual horizons. But you'll never have that emotional feeling that you'll get from analyzing your own games. And so that's one of the key reasons I think that analyzing your own games is so important, because it's an emotional intelligence that you are learning when you go over your own games. Okay, so we're going to start with, this is my little table of contents here, and several interesting topics today. And we're going to begin with Vishnu's exchange sack and then go on to Paul in New Jersey, who is an interesting example of pessimism in chess. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. Okay, so I'll try to come back to this table of contents, after one or two little segments. All right, so let's begin. And we're going to start off with Vishnu's game here. Very interesting opening and exchange sacrifice. So this game, by the way, was played in the ChessDojo ladder, I believe, against Bubba Tuff, aka Sam Hamilton. And they had one game already with this Bishop D3 system. I'll add, if you go to any of our YouTube videos or our Twitter, you can get a link to join our Discord channel. And from there, you can find many players who are willing to play a longer game. And it's longer games that I'm interested in going over in this show. Because it's longer games, so of course you can have some really deep thoughts about the game. And I think my own prejudice is that only with deep thoughts do you actually learn. Even blitz chess, because in blitz chess you're just regurgitating whatever thought it is that you had when you at one point thought deeply about the game. Okay, so in that, I want to just add, the cool thing about our ladder and our tournaments that we hold there is, I think not only do we have longer games, but I really want to stress we don't have a culture that I feel we don't have a culture of cheaters there. So that's just a comforting thing about our Discord channel, the ChessDojo Discord channel. Okay, Bishop D3, kind of a funny move, and let's just say some obvious things about it. You are blocking the coordination to D4. Your bishop really isn't striking anything at the moment. And the intention, of course, is to play knight e2, where the knights are going to reduplicate one another, be in each other's way. So those are all the negatives about Bishop d3. But the advantage is white hopes at some point to use his f-pawn, whether an f3 or f4. And we'll see some of those ideas in this game. So Vishnu was well prepared, and we have an opening guru on the ChessDojo site named Mitch, and he recommended this setup with knight c6. And it makes a lot of sense, is that given that white interrupted the coordination with d4, black is now going to try to fight for it. Okay, so bishop c2, And right away we can feel the discoordination of the bishop. And one of the things I guess I would have wished from Vishnu's annotations, which you can see here on the side, is that he would have spent a little bit more time thinking about the awkwardness of both sides' pieces. And I think part of the problem, actually, his annotations is he looked at the computer, which isn't a bad thing, but once you look, you're not going to see it with human eyes. So what I see as a King's Indian player, someone who dreams about playing the King's Indian, is I see a position where, like a lot of these hypermodern openings, we're trying to get white to make weird moves to support his center and then to strike back at the center. So bishop c2 feels a little funny, and bishop e3 feels a little bit more natural. But I think the queen is going to have to find a way to talk to the d pawn, right? Okay, so here we go. e5, d5, knight d4, and something like this was all in Vishnu's prep, where he had seen ideas like this, and is a very common idea in the King's Indian. So here we go. Knight takes, pawn takes, knight e2, knight e5. Very typical King's Indian play. And well, we'll just say I think the opening has gone totally satisfactorily for Vishnu up to this point. His bad bishop is now a great bishop, the bad bishop being on g7. The knight's found a square, and the only difficulty he has, of course, is that this pawn is vulnerable on d4. Okay, so let's slow it down a little bit and say that this is kind of where the game starts. White's next decision is kind of interesting and provocative. He plays rook b1, okay? And the thing that's weird about it is it gives Vishnu a lot of different opportunities now, because the natural move, I think, would have been to play knight d4 and let's say knight c4 and then rook b1. So by playing rook b1, Sam is giving Vishnu several different opportunities. And let's talk about them a little bit. Vishnu doesn't talk about these, and I want to stress I do not use the computer when I review these games, so the following things are just ideas that I came up with as interesting thoughts for how Black could play this position. The first is, besides taking knight c4, would have been to play c5, takes, knight takes, and claim that White's pieces are funny and everything's great for Black. Interesting position. It feels, at least intuitively to me, that Black has full play for the weakness of the pawns. Okay, another interesting try, more aggressive, more controversial too, would have been f5. And my thought here was that if takes, then we could play d3, snip, snip, queen takes, bishop f5. And that is just encouraged, that tactic is just encouraged by the rook being on b1. Now, of course, I guess that means that White should not play ef, and should probably take. And I wasn't sure about this position at all. I just know that King's Indian players like this kind of thing, with a very interesting initiative for the pawn. Just two examples, something to think about. And, you know, what will the computer say? No idea. I just know that this one in particular would be hard for White to face. Yeah, and I don't know. Hard for me to evaluate exactly what's going on. And of course, the pawn is still hanging. Okay, so those were just two options that Black had after rook b1. And it's almost like Sam was encouraging him to do something else, but Vishnu snips. Okay, knight d4, and now again, kind of a big decision for black. And I would also like to say that, yeah, in the annotations, Vishnu, if you're watching this, I would like to see more talk about pieces and what's going on. I think, for example, that if I were Sam, my narrative in this position would be something like, well, I have an awkward bishop on c2. I'm honestly a little bit down in development. But the dream is a little center control and maybe someday something going along the c file, right? It's going to be a long time, though. I got those bishops in the way. There's all kinds of other grief. For black, right, we have a potentially weak c-pawn, and the knight, we don't know where it goes, right? The knight on a c4, totally unclear what it's supposed to do. So, very interesting decision point. And I feel like a lot of these King's Indian positions, like the skill of playing the King's Indian, comes down to just coming up with different plans in positions like this. Vishnu says bishop d7. And here's a telling thing about computers in the database. So the main, Vishnu writes, so the main move by top players is knight e5 back. And it makes sense. The knight doesn't know what it wants on c4. You might as well move it back. Which I now believe is better than bishop d7, but even knight e5 seems to run into some trouble after f4, which surprisingly no one has played on the Lichess database. Well, and it's because f4 is very scary. And for example, if I was white, I'd really be worried about overextending. And I think a cool idea here that black's going to have in a lot of variations, so I'm going to mention it here, is the notion of throwing c5 in at any of these points, right? So in this position, I don't know what's going on, but it seems totally pleasant for black. And if, of course, takes, we're taking back with a knight. And again, I think a totally pleasant position for black. So, right, I think, I think, yeah, the human game, bishop d7 is also fine. What I like about bishop d7, by the way, is you're saying, well, maybe that knight is annoying to you on c4, and I want you to gift me a tempo to at least kick it away. And that's what happens here with h3. And now we have all kinds of interesting ideas for black. And you talk about b3 first. But h3 is this very aggressive attempt, right, to take over all the squares with a subsequent f4. Right, because let's just point out, Sam is dreaming about kicking the knight here and then hitting him with f4, hitting Vishnu with f4. Okay, so here we go, c5, and I thought this was okay, and Vishnu mentions rook e8. Snip, snip, b3. Okay, let's talk about this position. Knight b6, I wish, Vishnu, that you had spent a little bit of time on this, because intuitively I don't want the knight to go to b6. So kind of an interesting thought, just with the basis of activity, would be, well, could I play knight e5, f4, c5? Looks a little crazy, and at the very minimum it's going to involve a pawn sacrifice. But my notion is something like, well, if, by the way, the notion is that he's weakening himself and he's got awkward pieces, but the concrete notion was something like knight e2, knight c6, queen here, and knight d4, with the claim that we have interesting compensation. And again, no idea what the computer would say. That's just my sense of an interesting position. And the reason is it's unclear, what the knight's future is on knight b6. And so yeah, I wasn't a great fan of knight b6. And also, okay, so right, then we get this interesting position, like a lot of King's Indian positions. It's a mess, even though the knight on b6 breaks my heart a little bit because it's dominated by the b3 pawn. I still think that you should be fine, in particular because the bishop on c2 is also an awkward piece. And now I think a very big moment for white. White will have to make a choice of what to do. And I do not like what Sam did, because at least my sense is that you want to play c5. And this is not only giving you the tempo to do it, but the c5 pawn will blunt the bishop on a3. So you mentioned bishop b2. That certainly feels very natural to me. Another move that's a little weird but would make some sense would be b4. And I know I just said the thing about dominating the knight on b6, but the intention would be to play bishop b3 at some point to improve that one bad piece of white's. And of course, you could stall it. White could stall it by playing a move like rook e1 first. So one reason I want to stress that c5 at least feels natural to me is your knight and your bishop are set up to cover the light squares that will be weakened when you play c5. You give knight f3 as a variation. In a practical game, maybe the guy's going to go to e2. We have no idea. This following variation you give, Vishnu, feels very computery, but just this, well, a very interesting position to me. It feels like you're equal. Again, the bishop on c2 is weird. The knight on b6 is weird. And now with b4, at least you'll have to worry about knight c4 with the tempo. So yeah, I think this would have been very natural to me, and you're doing fine. So when I first saw this, Vishnu, this move that you played, let's put it on the board, I guess. You played d5. I was like, oh man, are you serious? Very shocking to me. And I can tell you're married to it. Like, you want to believe in this move. And yeah, you're right. It hurts me to give this a dubious move, Mark, right? Exclam question mark. And I was kind of searching my mind for how you came upon this, and I realized there's probably some classic games that you've seen in some kind of position like this. And so I want to get into that a little bit, but the main thing I want to say is you're giving the bishop on a3, who was going to be bad after c5, you're giving him something to do, which is namely to take your rook. Okay, so before we go into what happens next, I thought I was, just thinking about where your mind might have come up with this. And my mind reached to this classic game from Kasparov and Karpov 1990 World Championship. I think game 11 or something like that. And, I couldn't remember exactly. I had to research a little bit. But I knew that this exchange sacrifice that we're going to see is mildly similar in spirit to what you did. And let's take a look. So now c5, I believe theory doesn't like c5 much anymore, and that's, I guess, to do with this amazing move that Kasparov came up with. So let's take a look. c5, rook e3 now, queen takes, queen f8, and maybe white can do something else, but let's look at what happened. So, yeah, and I want to talk about this position a little bit to compare and contrast. So first I want to say that this exchange sacrifice that Kasparov did at the time was mind-blowing. It was completely mind-blowing that this was playable, and that black, seemingly, like a lot of people analyze this, was okay. Now, let's observe a couple things about this position, and then we're going to come back to your game. So, first thing to notice for me is that these pawns are dominating the knight. So that's one good thing that black has. The next thing is that, kind of like your game, the bishop on e2, it's unclear what its life is supposed to be. Also very critical is that when you make an exchange sacrifice, I think it's important to start dreaming about how would white possibly activate the rooks. And one good thing about this position for black is it's very hard for white to actually use a rook on the open file. So at least for the near future, there's not going to be, the rook is not going to have its influence felt anytime soon. Why don't we go through this beautiful game, and then we'll come back to your game, and then we'll kind of contrast. So king h1, very human move. Get off the dark squares. I'm sure the computer would tell you all kinds of other stuff. King h1, very Karpovian move as well. Rook b8, there were other moves, I'm sure. Kind of actually like your game, some kind of knight h5, I'm sure was also possible. So knight a4, rook b4, b3, bishop e6. Simple move. Notice you're just blocking off the e file. And again, very hard to imagine how the rooks get in, and definitely a lot of the compensation is that white has two minors that don't really know what they're doing. Now, by the way, you ask yourself, well, what's the evaluation of the position? Well, I think consensus ended up being that it was equal. But, looking at it just with raw human eyes, I guess the point is to say, oh, I sense the compensation. And what I mean by that is, like when most people saw this back in the day, it was not clear that black had compensation. So let's look at what happened. The knight needs to be recycled. Knight d3, simple chess. Rook h4, queen e7, g4, and now an exclam move, bishop d4, and the game is drawn, right? Perpetual check. Very correct game, if you will. And anyways, to me, that is an example, a paradigmatic example of the dark square exchange sacrifice in a King's Indian structure. Okay, so we'll start with this position. This one, and use that to contrast it with your exchange sacrifice. Let's flip the board here. That happens here. So the things that stand out to me that I don't like about this, let's go ahead and snip it off. Amazing, yeah, the queen's in the same spot even as in the Kasparov game. Is that what makes me very nervous about this is that your knight is not great. I get it, you have the dream of bringing it to d5. And that the files are truly potentially open here. So, and now, by the way, I did not turn on the computer, and I could be wrong. I know for a fact that Kasparov game, for example, I was a doubter. I remember seeing that. I was like, no, this can't be true. So maybe, if you want to correct me, that's fine, but I'm just telling you my sense of why I don't like this exchange sacrifice. So the open files of the rook and the fact that your pieces don't really have great homes yet. Even if it's black to move, I'm not sure. I think I still like white. So Sam has a choice to make. He plays b4, and very ambitious move. The hope, I guess, is that your bishop is going to go to b3. Sam's bishop is going to go to b3. The thing about it to me, though, is like, let's say we just move something like knight f3. I don't know what our compensation is, right? We're going to play things like rook e1, start putting stuff on the open file. And if you ever take on e4, thank you very much. We bring the bishop in, and if you play d4, then your knight's dead, and we'll play bishop d3 or whatever. So that's my intuitive sense why that it doesn't work out. And b4 definitely makes things more volatile, so more chances for you. Okay, so rook a d8 has to be good. E d5, I'm not a fan of e d5 because it is activating your business here. And you write that the rook b3 is more active than queen d2. Okay. Bishop h6. And let's just say this, right? Like, even though I don't like ed, I guess white is still on top. And, what, of course, just makes me nervous are the knight on d5 and this rook on the d file. But white certainly has a plan. It's to play bishop b3. And bishop h6, I guess, is a mistake, mostly because you're leaving the d4 square, which you're then basically handing to white. And white plays a good move. I have a feeling he could have done other moves too, though, especially now that once his knight is secure on d4, it's hard to believe in black's position. King h1, like Karpov, a lot of similarities really to the two games. Knight f4, and you write that bishop f4 was better. The bummer is, of course, by taking, you are mobilizing, developing the rook on f1. So knight f4, simple chess, strong point on d4, right? Queen c7, queen f2, simple chess, knight e2. And right, you said something like bishop b3 was better. I really like bishop b3. I kind of wanted to do that a long time ago. From the beginning of the game, since whatever it was, bishop d3, I move 4 or whatever, I've wanted him to fix the bishop. And so, right, bishop b3 here makes a lot of sense. But, very human move, because I want to trade your rooks, and I want to get rid of your knight. So bishop b3, okay. And I'm just assuming here that he's totally winning. So the game finished off with bishop e6, rook a5, and then a blunder with this, and you write you're down in time, which I can imagine, Do you have practical chances here? A little bit. Yeah, you still have a little bit of practical chances. But it's rough. It's rough. And it is true that him going back to e2, becoming passive like that, always gives you a little bit of hope. Okay, so very interesting game. Thank you, Vishnu. And so let's move on to Paul in New Jersey. And this, to me, is a very interesting game, and Paul in New Jersey is a very interesting subject to me. And what I mean by that is, in our hearts as chess players, we all have some optimism, and we all have some pessimism. And, there's some players like Luke Van Velde who've been described as over-optimistic. In his last couple tournaments, Kramnik was incredibly over-optimistic. And then there are players who are morose, who don't believe in their positions. And you can imagine there's a wide spectrum of players like that. And we all have both of those people basically in us, right? We just might have a little bit more or a little bit less. Just in terms of really, it's about our own self-confidence. And I guess it would apply to other areas of our lives outside the chessboard as well. One thing that's interesting, though, is that when you start thinking of top players, you can't think of too many who are incredibly morose or downbeat, defeatist about their own positions. There are definitely players who are safer than others, definitely players who accept more risk than others. So one of the things that's interesting to me about Paul, we've done many of his games here on the show, is that he is an example of someone on the far end of the defeatist side of the spectrum. And that just makes him an interesting specimen because we all have a little bit of Paul in us. Okay, so let's start up into the game. So Paul has had a terrible time with the French, just a terrible time. And he did or followed a little bit of a YouTube video that I did called An Easy System Against the French to Make Them Squirm, something like that. I loved the video, and Paul is following it here. And what's interesting about it is it's a way for Paul to force himself to play more aggressive chess, which he's not really used to doing. Far more of a solid player and a materialist player, and here he's going to sack some stuff. Okay, so let's take a look. Bishop d3, c takes, and I don't know if Paul just didn't remember or whatever, but in the video, the move that I proposed was castles. And actually, in the next game, we're going to do Nicholas playing the French in a position where I feel like French players are very comfortable, and maybe it's objectively better for white than this. But what the idea of this, the video that I did was to try to highlight the psychological insecurities of the French player, and so that was what that video does. And I do believe in the soundness, at least, of this opening. So you can go watch it. We talk about d takes c3, knight takes c3, full nice compensation. And as an illustration, really, I came up with the idea for white really by having faced this position, which I think is fine for black, but is psychologically uncomfortable for black. So the idea I had with the video was, wait a second, can I just sack the pawn on c3 to attain similar compensation to this? So here we go, knight c3, and my understanding as a French player is that black needs to play the very weird looking a6 move in order to keep stuff off of b5. Now, Paul's opponent, however, plays queen e5, and this, I think, is full compensation. Rook e1, queen c7, knight d5, very good, queen a5. And let's stop and think about this for a moment. Paul, to his credit, I don't think, obviously wasn't using the computer for this analysis, just giving his take on the position. And so many times against the French, we've seen Paul kind of downbeat. And one of the things about playing against the French is you have to murder the guy. You have to murder the guy. And for certain in this position, I very much believe in white. I didn't turn on the computer either, but I definitely believe in white. I believe in the development. I believe in the active pieces. And for sure, we need to play actively here. So Paul doesn't give any remarks about knight c3, which I guess means that he thought it was forced or just, what had to be played. And to me, this is a good example for training as a tactical, aggressive player, because you cannot give away time in a position like this. A tempo is worth a lot in a position like this. Black obviously has a couple moves before he castles, and that's what we need to prevent. So to me, the move that right away, boom, pops to mind is rook e5. Simple. Why? Because we're preventing moving our knight. I want to keep that knight there as long as possible. And I have a dirty threat of knight f6. Okay? So one thing about this move is that it'd be very hard to calculate out like what exactly is going to happen. But it's definitely something that white should believe in because of the development advantage. And we're going to get another tempo here. And kind of a fun variation that I was just thinking of just now was, let's say he goes back. That would be my first instinct myself. bishop g5. And I think maybe there's even a better move than bishop g5. Bishop f4. Actually, bishop f4 is also good. But I just saw this as a fun variation with g6 and kind of a rare mate here. And that's something like that is what black deserves. You know, definitely something like that is what black deserves. So, yeah, you know, rook e5 for sure, and then see what the guy does. Okay, so here we go. Knight c3, knight f6, bishop d2, bishop b4. Kind of weird. The guy should be thinking about moves like queen d8, bishop c6, and bishop b4 is going to gift you the dark squares, which will at least be some kind of tempo. And he says, no, I want to give it to you this way. All right. And you write, at this point, I felt I had compensation for the pawn. Of course you do. And look at this, bishop b4. Now, this is a really interesting thing, Paul. You give bishop b4 a question mark. And I just want to tell you, there's no way that bishop b4 can be wrong. There's just no way. That is a strong move, my friend. And it is hard to imagine black surviving this. You're cutting him open with your unopposed bishop, and now the guy he's not going to castle, as far as I can tell. The guy's just not going to castle. So let's read what you wrote. I thought I was protecting my bishop on d3 and gaining a tempo by attacking the queen. However, b4 was a bad square for the bishop. I considered bishop c4, bishop c2, bishop e2, all these things. And no, you play bishop b4 in a heartbeat. Of course, you worry about where the queen moves next. Bishop b4 is a good move. Okay, so here we go. Queen b6. All right. Rook c1. Question mark. I played this move without much thought. I should have seen the threat of knight d5. Once again, I had no idea how to exploit black's uncastled king. Paul, you're doing it right now. You're doing it right now. You are exploiting his uncastled king. Knight d5. Okay. Honestly, I think he's close to lost, and I don't have any, any advice, any advice for this guy. Knight d5, and here's a really weird thing, Paul, and I really want you to reflect on this and think about your own pessimism, and for other people, just think about pessimism in general, because a position like this, you gotta believe. You gotta believe in the position. And what Paul does here is basically doesn't believe in the power of this beautiful, beautiful bishop. Now, what should he do without thinking? He should play bishop c5. Why didn't he do it? Because he was afraid of losing the pawn. Very sad. Very sad. Now think about it this way, Paul. Put yourself in black's position. Would you take that pawn? I mean, maybe you do, but you don't want to. It's not something you want to do. You know, we got monster compensation after queen takes b2. After that, you can play bishop e4, whatever you like. You're crushing the guy. You know, I would say game over. So, very peculiar. Rook e4. Bishop c6. Should you still play bishop c5? Yeah. Don't give him your bishop. Okay. Now some weird stuff happens. Queen c2. And by the way, you do still have a little bit of compensation left, even after all this. So he then makes a mistake. And what's interesting about this is now you feel you're doing all right, because you got your pawn back. And I really want to stress that, you're doing okay now, but the pawn, that wasn't, the pawn wasn't such a big thing. Okay, so queen c6, rook c6. Now here, I'm going to read what you wrote. I should have offered a draw, but I thought I was better because I had a queenside majority and my rooks were more active. By the way, by far the latter more than the former. The rooks being active counts simply more. This was my first big mistake. I was overconfident. Paul, think about it. Think about what you're saying. You were overconfident and that was your problem here? You're doing great, buddy. You're doing great. It's not a problem of overconfidence. That's not your issue. I'm pretty sure it's lack of confidence that's the issue. So, and here, I feel like black is the one who makes a big mistake, and you didn't note it. Castles, why is it a mistake? Well, the king should very much at least dream about playing king d7. If he can not get hit with one of those rooks, then his king will be more active than your king. And even if he sacrifices a pawn, it's probably worth it. If you find some way to win a pawn here. I'm not even sure how it would work, but in any case, this position now, whoa, buddy. Now we've got a very nice edge here for ourselves. And this is, let's say it's close to winning, something like that. Okay. So you played f3, and this is maybe an inaccuracy. I'm going to call it an inaccuracy because what you don't want to happen is the rook gaining full scope onto the 7th rank, and that might happen. In fact, f3, I just realized later we're going to have a game by a guy named Ayush, our penultimate game of today, and he makes a similar inaccuracy. So the candidate moves here, I think, should be this should begin with king f1, and the point of king e2 is to prevent the invasion on the d file. And by the way, when he castled, he kind of took away some of his own time. Not only he owes you a pawn move for Luft, and and the king is not active. Okay, so f3, g6, king f2, rook fc8, and now you do a very ambitious move, rook a6. And then your opponent, I think, needs to think about rook c7. That's what he needs to think about. In any case, let's look at what he did. Rook takes b4. You give this a question mark. Come on, Paul. Come on. Here was my second big mistake. I should have played rook a7. Then after rook b2, I would have had a passed pawn. I thought it would be hard to win after that because my pawn was only in the 3rd rank. Now, that position is a draw with rook a7, rook b2. b4, of course you're better. You have the active rook and the better king and the more active pawns. Of course you're better in this position, close to winning. Okay, by the way, I'll make a pitch for everybody out there. My experience with most players these days is that their openings are amazing. Think about Paul. He has a wide knowledge of different openings, but their endgames are poor, and this is where you can really knock people out. By the way, I actually did a video that you could watch called Why Openings Won't Take You to the Next Level, and I used Paul as a guinea pig in that video. And one thing I realized in looking over this game is that the people who lack confidence in their own ability, and again, we all have that. I certainly have played many scared moves in my life and have played many positions where I didn't believe in myself. So I think no one is immune from that feeling of playing terrible and not feeling in control. That it's those players the players who lack confidence, who are the same ones who really go deep in the openings, because the openings then give them a sensation of power, of having a weapon at their disposal that isn't even really of their own making, and therefore that's why they like it, because they distrust their own moves, their own thoughts, and they feel like if they can ride this tiger that somebody else created, that they will then be strong. And the fact is that openings can help. You can learn stuff about chess through openings, but they're not going to give you the kind of power that you're hoping to get. Okay, here we go. Rook b7, king e3. I considered rook d6. No, your rook's beautiful. You've got the active rook, he's got the passive one. By the way, let me say something simple. The pawns on a3 and b4, if the rook ever penetrates, his rook, one great thing about your position here is that you should, in principle, be winning all of those positions because your pawns are faster and they're connected. Okay, so that already as a conceptual thing should lead you to say, hey, I've got the active rook forever here. King f8, king up. I think you're very close to winning. Okay, king d7, and now b5. All right, now it's getting close, right, where we want to be accurate. This b5 move, I believe in. I think you should still be great. The other moves you can consider are rook d6, followed by like king c7, rook c6. Very strong position after that, and a hard choice for black of which way to go. And sure, a4. Okay, so b5. I don't think this throws it away, nor do I think your next move is a double question mark. Okay, double question mark. This was my third big mistake, and it was fatal. I thought I was trading into a winning king and pawn ending. I should have played king b4. This illustrates my lack of positional understanding. I don't know, Paul. First of all, I am not at all convinced that this pawn ending is losing for you. Not at all. And I want to say that, you know, if you play king b4, the danger is that maybe the guy can hold with king c8, king b7. Maybe. But your rook is still much better. Yeah, it's a hard business. Let me just look briefly. Honestly, I believe in your move more. I just want to take a look. Something like this, right, is not what we wanted. Okay, good. That's not what we wanted. So let's take a look at your move and look at this ending. Okay, so first of all, I think you were entirely correct for your intuition anyway, to say that you're winning this ending. Now, there's two ways to be in this ending. One is when you're in time pressure and you just have to intuitively go for it. And the other is if you have a little bit of time, you start counting it out. But the simple way to approach it, I think, is that you want to save your tempi, your pawn tempi, that is, right? And so you want to start counting it out, and if you don't have time to count it out, then you want to play king b5 here, right? Where you should be winning that position after king b5. Yeah, it's hard to imagine why you wouldn't be winning after king b5. To be a little careful in everything. But okay, let's look at what happened, because I still think you're probably winning after a4. a6. Now, the thing about a6 is that now it gives you the b6 square, right? Now, it takes away b5, I get it, but it gives you the b6 square. a5, committal, g5, and now you play g4, which is the most, the fastest way to do this business. And we're going to see that in the game, things wrap up with you being on the losing end of the tempi, but maybe you could be on top, and just a simple thing to see is that even though he's got more pawns, him playing e5 is always really scary for the dude because of king d5. So that suggests that you have chances after g3, and you can kind of conceptually see it after what happens here, because he simply runs you out of moves here. Right now you're out of moves. If he had played e5 or f5, you're going to get the d5 square, and I assume be winning. So Paul, look, I'm sure I can't fix you. I can't cure you of your pessimism. But what I think is interesting about going over your own games is that you can learn things about yourself. And what I see is that the fears that you have are generally unnecessary, right? They're unnecessary fears. And if you're aware of that, I think you will make progress. And I do think that playing, or the ability, having the willingness, let me put it that way, having the willingness to play aggressive openings where you are down some material and feel insecure because you are down material like that will very much help your chess. Okay, so let's go to the next game, and this is Nicholas. Let me flip the board here. Nicholas plays a great game here, which I'm going to call this a conceptual game, where I feel like I got something out of it too as a French player. Okay, so here we go. One reason to play a system like the one I just recommended for Paul is that you have to learn a lot less theory. And here it's kind of a nightmare for white because black can do so many different moves here. And I wasn't really that familiar with the plan Nicholas played. So he plays bishop e7, bishop e3, b6, and his intention is, I think, that if the white bishop moves on f1, to play bishop a6. But he has a deeper and darker plan in his soul prepared. And I'll come back to actually maybe how this could be changed with the move order too. So queen d2, knight c6, castles c4. Very nice. And I don't know if this is, the evaluation, but the idea is very nice. And the idea, of course, is to mate white. And I wonder, as a French player, that if I was going to do this, maybe I could just start off with castles and knight c6 and only play c4 when if he castles. And so that would be an improved version of what we're going to get in this game. So, all right. Queen d2, knight c6, castles. Of course, he didn't have to castle. He could have played still bishop e2 and castle short. c4, and right now, white loses time in a critical way. Here, if he wants to play f5, he should just go ahead and do it. And Nicholas points that out. And what this shows is something we've talked about on this show before, is that when there is opposite sides castling, tempo will rise in value. And in fact, it's really, and why? Because the initiative counts for more. And if you get your initiative started against his king, he's going to have to pull all his pieces back to deal with your troubles that you're giving him. So g4, clear loss of time, because I think, and this is something Nicholas pointed out, f5 already playable. Okay, so here we go. c4, g4, b5. I like it a lot. I like it a lot. And the idea is, like I said, the initiative counts for more, and maybe he's being foolish by taking this thing. Knight b4, very nice move. And Nicholas points out others, but knight b4 definitely has to be at least reasonable. And check out this finish, my friends. a3, and now he's going to really do him dirty. Knight a2, king b1, c3. It's a rough life. It's a rough life. And I'm just assuming it's all over here. And he actually just resigns. I mean, what are you going to do? What are you going to do in a position like that? Yeah. So, nice trick. And let me just say one thing that's interesting, for me to think about anyway, is when we look at this c4 idea, let's repurpose Vishnu's board here and go to start. We look at, say, this position, and let's look at the standard line. There's many standard lines, of course, but let's just look at a standard one. Excuse me, I didn't mean to do that. F5, F3, F4, and what you see here is that the French line that Nicholas had is a mirror image of this one, where the f-pawn, like the c-pawn in that variation, is creating this wedge that is going to come after the black king, and with the white king in this case, black king in his case, and white king is still a white king, I'm sorry. Anyways, so, it's the same idea. And one interesting thing about being a French player myself, and someone who dreams about playing the King's Indian, is in general in the French, you are attacking on the queen side. And in the King's Indian, you get to attack on the king side where usually the king is. So with that c4 move, c4 in the French I generally look down upon, but it's a great example of, hey, when you're playing the French and you play c4 in those positions, when white's castled long, it's very similar to this f4 business. And as we saw in that game, black's attack was even faster than it is here. Okay, we are now going to go on to 3 different examples of space. And let me go to my little table of contents here. I brought up the World War I trench warfare photo for Paul in New Jersey's game. It just feels so defeatist, and when I imagine being in the trenches there, that's kind of how I feel a lot of those guys must have felt. Okay, we're going to do Caro space, Dragon space, and then Rat space, and that'll be our space segment of the day. So let's go back and start in on this game. This is Diags. I think Diags has been here once more on the show. And since he's black, let's flip this around. So, very topical opening. And I really believe in this for white, though I'm not sure which move he should do. In addition to knight f3, of course, there's the famous h4 move. Loads of things are possible for white, and the general dynamic, which is so fascinating, is that we have black gets his bishop out, and that's why this variation was not seen as any good when I was a kid back in the day. Black gets his bishop out, but he's lost a tempo compared to the French, right? It's the French down a tempo. And a fascinating thing about it is that black wants to play c5, but the second he plays c5, the value of time is going to dramatically rise because the position's opening up, and then you have to worry about this diagonal. You got to worry about the knight coming to d4 once c5 is played. So, the artistry of black here is knowing when to play c5. Okay, white, though, in this time says, let's open it up right away. It's got to be a good move. And black plays bishop b4. Now, as a French player, the problem of bishop b4 is you are inviting white to trade it off. But the good part about what you're doing, and you write about this, is that we as black want to trade off some pieces because we lack space. And so this theme of space, as I've said on the show before, is really the new frontier in chess. It's been so for a while. Not only is it hard to understand the space advantage, but it's also incredibly hard to wield. So in this position, I think you're right that bishop d2 is not as testing as a move like knight c3, because in that position with knight c3, if you ever take the thing on c3, then you will be punished by losing your best piece and bringing another pawn to the center. So bishop d2. Also here, I don't like knight d2. I think I'd rather see queen d2. Okay, so a3, strange, and you correctly guessed now what his intentions were going to be, namely to play c5 and b4. And one thing that c5 and b4 is not going to do is it's not going to hem in your dark square bishop. So one of the key things for both sides to think about when playing for space is, am I making some or many of black's pieces poor? Okay, so h6, I guess I would have wanted a castle, but I'm a tempo fiend, as Vishnu says. All right, c5, controversial, mostly because of time, but also because black's pieces are all beautiful here. Knight d7, b6, very good, very good, I like black. b4, a5, a very standard way of breaking down this kind of business. And let's just say there's none of white's pieces are especially happy here. Queen b3. Now, very natural move, but notice that it did take away the natural square for the knight on d2. And it's this clump of pieces that is a big problem for white, right? Okay, so AB. Now let me criticize this move a little bit. In general, I think you're the one who is the master of the tension in this position. And that just means that you get to decide when to release the tension. So when you play AB, you're giving white more options. So just the intuitive move here for black would be queen c7, and I think you're doing great. I really think you're doing great. Okay, so let's see what happened here. Rook a, queen c7, rook a3, and now we're seeing that he's getting to fight for the a file. Now, let me say a little bit about space. The problem of having space is that if you trade everything off, or if you trade everything off, your position won't have the capacity to hold the space, and then black ends up coming around. And a lot of that happens in this game. And that's kind of an abstract thing to understand. Like I said, space is not easy to understand. But that is the idea, and that word capacity is a translation from the Russian from these hardcore theorists, let's say. In this position, white has some hopes of living just because he's got the A file. And I like that move a lot. So you're opening up a second front, and I think the guy needs to take on f6, because with the move he does, you get to start hacking his center apart. So fe5, knight e5. In general, white doesn't want to trade pieces, right? Now, his position's definitely getting creaky. There's no doubt about it. But if he was going to play for space, then ideally anyway, he would not do this. And he throws this move in, which you give a question mark to, and probably correct, but he is already suffering. For example, I don't know, queen takes, pawn, we trade. I guess this was his best. And, something like that. He's suffering. I mean, that's suffering. That's real suffering. This bishop, one of the beauties is it takes away the b1 square. So definitely better for black. Close to winning, honestly. So already he's in big trouble here. So c takes, queen takes, queen takes, knight g6, and you're doing great. And this is a common feature that happens when you get the space advantage, when the space advantage falls apart, is that all of a sudden there's all these delicious squares for you to bounce around in. And I guess he should play something like queen e3, but it's hard to say. So now I would say you're winning, and it's because of not only your central pawns and your better pieces, but squares like f4 now are just so juicy and open for you. Queen c3, you gave h3. Weird actually, and let's mention that if he's going to move a pawn, it should be g3 to dominate your knight, right? Now, rook f6, let me be a little critical about rook f6. First of all, it looks weird. But if you wanted to deal with the pawn, I think, e5, I think that's what you want to do. Now, maybe I'm wrong, actually. Maybe I might do a take back on that one. But, I'm a little worried about b5 or something. But in general, that's the move I want to make. Maybe I am wrong on that one. Maybe I'll take my criticism back. Rook f6, in any case, you're doing great here. And b5 is a strange move, and you took advantage of it nicely. And now, of course, you're totally winning. The knight will come to f4. Very nice. Snug as a bug in a rug. Queen f3 would be more natural, but yes, you are totally winning here. And the guy finally resigns. So, very interesting game for me in that it's another example of the space advantage gone wrong. And honestly, it was hard for white to hold his space advantage, and it was wrong for him to try to hold the space advantage because mostly his pieces weren't making that much sense. And more importantly, if you're going to do the space advantage, like I said, it should try to dominate one or more of your minor pieces. Okay, let's now do dragon space. So, what do I mean by dragon space? Let's flip this. We're going to get a dragon structure with colors reversed, and we're going to think a little bit about the space advantage there. And there's some key mistakes in this game that I think illustrate what we want and don't want with space. Okay, c4, all pretty well-known stuff. And this is an interesting position for me. I played this as a kid as black. And, back then we didn't have computers or anything. And a3 was then the most common move, probably still is, in this position. And it was a very interesting and dynamic position. And anyways, I bring up the thing with computers just because now when you turn it on, the beast on, it says black is totally fine. And back in the day, that was just not clear what was going on in this position. And even, I don't know, maybe I should take it back. It just changes your feeling about the position once you see the computer saying something like black is fine. Okay, so let's talk about this position. Black has a little more space, and it has to do with the fact that in the dragon structure, white often has grief dealing with knight d4. the d4 square in general, because this pawn is not on e3, or it has difficulty coming to e3. At some point, he might want to put it there, but of course, if he does, he has to worry about the d3 pawn. Okay, so that's kind of the significant dynamic that we have in front of us, is how are we dealing with this knight d4 at some point. We should mention, like in all Sicilians, the pawn on c7 is not participating in the central fight. That's like just a key drawback of playing the open Sicilian. So, right, and this variation, by the way, you can get with reversed colors, and I think it would, if you imagine f5 already on the board, that's a common position that you see top GM level games with colors reversed. Also bishop e6, i.e. bishop e3 with colors reversed. Okay, so b3, and you write this is not the main line, and you say, but it can't be wrong. I think it can be wrong. It's not like white's losing or anything, but I think it'll help us understand some of the problems with the white position with b3. Is that, and this is, by the way, when you write annotations, when you say stuff like it's not the main line, it doesn't help your understanding that much, I feel, because what really you should say is like, okay, well, what's weird about b3? And to my mind, what's weird about b3, first of all, is that it blocks the queen. And it's not like the queen immediately wants to come out to those squares, but it's just a degree of freedom that white is limiting by playing b3. Also, and maybe more important, white needs to start an initiative on the queen side. And this b4 is not only to gain, to play maybe b5, but more importantly to gain some squares, maybe land on c5 with a knight is a nice idea, and of course the rook wants to find its way to c1. Another actually totally viable move here, of course, is bishop e3. Okay, so b3 is a funny move, and Tim, you played bishop e6. Not bad. I guess I would like, in the spirit of punishing him, to play bishop g4 here. And that will just make things like knight d4 more operational. Another simple plan that you could use to intend to play knight d4 is to play rook e8, bishop f8, so that knight d4 gains some more heft. So bishop e6. Yeah, also, after b3, your bishop doesn't have any scope on the queen side. So it's anti-intuitive to me that you land it on e6. Okay, bishop b2, f6, rook c1. Okay, queen d7, and now a very instructive mistake. Very instructive mistake. White plays rook e1. And we all know instantly when we see it what his thought is. The guy thinks that bishop h3 is some nasty big threat to face his position. And his intention with rook e1 is to say, no way are you going to exchange my bishop, buddy. And if you, Tim, come down, I'm just going to park it, and I'm going to proudly keep my beautiful bishop. By the way, let me say something obvious. What we're seeing on the right-hand side of the screen are people's notes. And as before, many great notes, and I don't always read them, but I wanted to put them there so you can get a flavor of what people are saying as we're talking about their games. So very instructive mistake with rook e1, a clean loss of tempo, and let's talk about why. White would love to trade off that bishop on g2. He wants some trades. So by all means, something like knight d2 now would be a thought for white. Also a very nice move for him. Maybe even more dynamic would be knight e4, intending what I said before with knight c5. Open the bishop on b2, get some play on the c-file, and it's the typical Sicilian story of play against that dirty c7 pawn. Also trying to grab the two bishops with knight c5. So this is a clear lack of time. And I guess just to put into perspective how bad news this is, there are GMs. This is hard to imagine because it's so fanatical. But there are GMs who will do the following plan to exchange off black's beautiful e6 bishop. Get ready for it. h4, king h2. Move the queen somewhere. Move this rook over here. Move the queen back. Put the queen on f1. Then play bishop h3. Even then, they might not get the exchange. But the reason I'm showing you that is to give you a sense of how fanatical, how fanatical a dragon player can be trying to get that exchange. And I learned that particular maneuver from my friend Eugene Perelstein, GM Eugene Perelstein. He plays the accelerated dragon, so a lot of times the pawn will be on c5. But very similar thing. No reason for white to fear it. And remember, not only is white giving black a tempo with rook e1, but bishop h3, in addition to giving away his beautiful e6 bishop, is giving away time. But the theme that we're looking at here, of course, is simply that by giving away our space, our pieces, we're taking away the potential space advantage that we have associated with an eventual knight d4. Okay, rook e1, a5, okay, interesting. In kind of a hilarious pre-computer thing, actually, that I just remembered. I remember being at there was a camp that was held. It's kind of like the predecessor to Greg Shahada's U.S. Chess School camp. Back in the day, New York City, with GM Edmar Mednis. And I believe we had a position like this. a3, might have been the exact same one. And black played a5. And Mednis then said something to the effect of, not only is this terrible, but maybe black is lost after this move. Now, of course, I think a5 is actually fine, and saying it's lost is being dogmatic. But what is true is that you are giving white a lot of squares by playing a5. So that's why your a5 is a little controversial, and my sense is you didn't know about the plan, if I can call it that, the plan of sinking the knight onto d4. Yeah, that some kind of preparation for that should be on the way. And I should have mentioned it earlier, but a funny business thing about queen d7 is you're making knight e4 c5 stronger. So if you had left it on d8, you would have had the option to say knight d7 and no trades for you. Right? No trades for you. Okay, so here we go. Knight d2. a4. Now you give this a funny move, Mark, because maybe the computer dislikes it, but that was your intention, obviously. And to a certain extent, you're making good on having put your bishop on e6, right? Trying to gain scope. So here the engine likes knight takes a4, and let's just say why. Let's put it in human terms. Because white wants to trade pieces, and the rook on c1 wants open, right? So instead, with his move, snip, snip, now your bishop on e6, all of a sudden, is a much bigger beast. I like, by the way, that you were not afraid of this damage of the pawn structure because, in fact, it's to your advantage, by all means. And this is even great that you get to use that square later, maybe for a bishop, and that your scope is open. So by all means, a mistake. And again, for everybody, I encourage people to write out why they think a given move was bad. Don't necessarily, just leave it with, oh, the computer thought it was a terrible, terrible thing. Okay, knight d5. Maybe knight d4 here might be interesting. Knight d5, rook a1, knight c3. The computer hates this. Right. And in fact, I think the only reason to play knight d5 is to put the bishop here, just making life miserable for white. So you trade, right? And again, I think if we don't put these things into words, we won't understand them. And one of the things I said earlier about Blitz is I feel with Blitz we are often just recapitulating the thoughts we had when we were playing, longer games or when we were studying. And so that's why saying it, writing it out is such a big thing. Now look at what you do. You play bishop d5, and what does he do? He plays bishop f1. Such is the mania. White is, believes in his bishop. And I think, a lot of players are a little bit like this in terms of dogmatism. The joy of that bishop for a dragon player, or in this case somebody who's playing with reverse colors, is such that they're not appreciating that bishop d5 really wasn't the greatest move, because it gave away black's best piece. Bishop f1, terrible move. Bishop c5, interesting. So now you feel emboldened to go after the guy. Moves like knight d4 really come to mind here. Knight d4, now is the moment. And if he takes, this is kind of the idea of the opening, really. Our space advantage is monstrous. Yeah, very nice space advantage here for black, in addition to this unopposed beast over here. So bishop c5, e3. Not a bad move, and this creates some interesting problems for you because you now kind of go all out in terms of trying to knock him out with an attack on the king. Where, when you think about it, the bishop on f1, the only thing it does do is it guards his man. Other than that, it doesn't do that much. And, what's funny, too, is that e3 now makes the bishop on f1 have a purpose. And like we said, he does want to play e3. The drama, of course, is the pawn on d3, but at least the bishop on f1 is doing that. So, right, this queen f5, it certainly looks reasonable. I can imagine even doing it myself, especially in a blitz game. But the problem is that you're chasing his bad piece. What I mean by that is you're giving that bad piece something to do on f1. And I'm assuming a right move would be something like b5 or some kind of thing to b4. Now I have to turn on my fan for just a little bit. It's going to make a little noise. I apologize in advance. It's super hot today, so I have to do something. Okay, here we go. Queen f5, queen e2, bishop f3. Now, it's funny, when you say the engine hates this, and the engine wants queen d7, once you've played queen f5, you shouldn't criticize bishop f3, right? Bishop f3 is the natural follow-up, and queen e2 is like demanding that you play it. Right, and now notice, he might get some Sicilian play with b4, b5. And you said, no, I'm going to stop you. And now notice, you kind of should have done it before. And what we have on our hands here is a trader. A guy who just trades it all off now. I'm guessing that a move like d4 makes more sense to me, right? He could, yeah. Something like d4 seems like it'd be reasonable. Instead, we're going to get somebody here who just wants to trade everything off because they're fearful. And now we get a position where, yeah, I think you have a nice two-bishop advantage. You criticize queen c8, but to me it didn't look that bad. It certainly looks natural. I don't know, yeah. Could you have done other things? Absolutely. Like just rook d8. The bishop on f3, one of its grand jobs is it's going to say that rook a7 isn't anything special. But I don't think this was terrible. That was certainly not the move, right? Now we snip everything off. We do this, and you are close to winning here. Queen a2, bishop d1. You're right. This is not dubious. That would be a very kind description of the quality of this move. This is a terrible move. Well, I don't know. It certainly makes a certain amount of sense. But, okay, I'll grant you it's not the best. I know why you did it, though. We know why you did it. And let's just say one interesting thing that we actually talked about on this show before is endgame like this. It's pretty hard to deal with the two bishop advantage. Let's say something obvious, though. I think probably what you feared was you saw variations, let's say bishop f8, b4, and then all of a sudden it's like, oh no, what happened to me? So I guess, we should play something like bishop e7. Gotta be, and then, that's a delicate dance when we play in moves like that. So, all right, this happens, and this happens, and queen e7 happens, and I'm not sure that's a terrible move. I get it. I get why you did it. And the important thing to realize, I think, is that you are still a touch better in this position. Game probably should be a draw, but the reason I think you have some prospects is because you have the outside pass pawn. And the simple thing to end the discussion of this game with is that when you're in the queen ending, you should just know two things. The person with the centralized queen is better, and the person with the passed pawn is better. Why is the passed pawn such a big deal in the queen ending? Because you can remove the blockader by threatening a trade. That simple. And so here, although I believe white should hold, the second he moves the queen, he has to worry about b5. So in the game, white blundered with queen b5, and the game was over. It happens. It happens. Okay. So let's go on now to rat space. I've had the privilege of studying Chess Duels by Saruwan, and I finally understood something that I could not grasp for the life of me, and that is back in the day, loads of strong players in this position would play knight d2. Okay? And I never understood it. I was like, bro, come on, the knight has got to go to c3. But the weird thing about it is they were terrified of the rat, and they thought that they would have a better version of the rat if white played knight d2 first. So they were actually like, oh, I don't want this position for myself as white. Now, never-ending story about the computer. The computer, of course, despises this position for white. And there's many moves they can do. Like, funnily enough, I turned the computer on just to see, and it wants like h4 immediately, But the human response is just to play h3, knight f3. And one thing to see, and this applies a little bit to the game we're about to look at, is that if e5, then the knight is dominated. Okay? And we're going to get, actually, like the Caro structure, the bishop on c8 gets to come out. So that is, well, I'll just show a little bit. It's a great game with Saruwan against my sensei, Vasily Smyslov, where it went like this. Knight h6, bishop d3, castles, castles, f6, rook e1, knight f7, and it looks obscene, but it's actually, the computer hates it, let's just be clear, but when you look at it from a human perspective, it's not entirely obvious what white should do and why white should be better, and in particular, the pawns are dominating these knights. Anyways, long story. Let me go back to the game. Knight f3, g6. Here Bradley disparages the hyper-accelerated. I think it's fine. c3. By the way, what's interesting about c3 is, so my friend Eugene Berlstein, as I mentioned before, hyper-accelerated. I don't know why it's called hyper. To me, it's just the accelerated dragon. He has, let me show the c3 first. He came up with this cool idea, or at least I saw it through him, is that against the Smith-Morra, what you do is you play like this. Excuse me, and then you play d5 in this position. So this is the thing that black is going to follow here. And to me, it's very rat-like. It's very rat-like, this structure. And it becomes more rat-like with e5. Surprisingly, I think black is fine after e5. And first of all, black, I think, it's a very playable position for black. And I want to say that that came as a surprise to me when I was looking at Eugene's games in this kind of position. He wrote a book about this, by the way, as a website does some stuff with a lot of this kind of theory. Vishnu is playing this kind of setup as well. I will take it back. I just playing the accelerated dragon sometimes. In any case, the problem with e5 is you lost a tempo, and it's not like white's lost or anything, but black has a playable way of doing the position with knight h6, castles f6, and the knight can hop, if it needs to, back to f7. And again, the pawn on f6 will dominate the knight on f3. That's my understanding of this system in any case. So instead, black plays bishop g4, which I can't imagine is that wrong. Bishop b5. So notice what white does here. He congratulates himself on this pawn weakness. And I think this is a key spot for talking about my hashtag, pawns aren't people. The pawns are not important. They really aren't. They're only important in terms of making your pieces good or bad. And what you do here with bishop b5 is you are trading off one of your pieces, and black then has more space to move around in. So imagine it like this. In a crowded house, or first imagine a mansion, and there's one of these 3.5 bath mansions you find on whatever real estate site you're looking at, and in these 3.5 bathroom situations, you got a family, and at 7 o'clock in the morning, everyone's fighting to get in there to wash their hair, to look at themselves in the mirror, and you got one kid yelling at the other kid to get out of there, and they won't get out. It's just a mess. And it's the same thing when you have a crowded chess position, that you have more than one piece that wants to use the same bathroom. In contrast, white is the one with the 3.5 bedroom house, and black is the one with only like one bedroom. And you'll see it in a lot of these positions where black, doesn't get to put two pieces on one square, just like it's hard to have more than one kid in the bathroom at the same time. Okay, so here we go. Bishop b5, I don't like it. Snip, not a fan. Knight d2, and here black had some interesting decisions to make. He should think about knight h6 and c5, maybe even c5 immediately here. By no means should he do what happens, which is e6 and then h3 and lose the... It's not that you lose the bishop, but white created his own drama here with these reduplicating knights and blocking the bishop. So this setup that white does really enables this h3 move. Now, one thing that would certainly be controversial, but I think black should think about it, is playing bishop f5 here. Now you could say to yourself, cry, aren't you like contradicting yourself? You were talking about space and yada yada. Well, the thing that's happening here is white's got his own problems with those knights, and if we can keep our bishop on for, or not make the exchange, we don't free white's position up. And you know, part of the hope would be if he ever smacks us with g4 that we could play moves like bishop e4. In any case, what I feel like happens in the next couple of moves is that black does not sense the urgency of needing to play c5 ASAP. And so, even right now, he should think about playing it, even if it means sacrificing a pawn. Because he will definitely have compensation. And for example, something like this. Yeah, you got some compensation. And at some point we're not going to play f6 now, but we're going to dream about things to knock down the center. Now, that's just an example, but black needs to feel that urgency. And here, b3, good move, because now your bishop is threatening to come to the square of blockade doom for black. Castles, and he just lets it happen. He just says, give it to me. And this is terrifying for me to see this in terms of the space. And again, another space grab move, g4. Absolutely. And let's say two things about g4. That's right, Rosebud. That black is happy to send his knight on b8 off to college. You get him off to college, that bathroom becomes a much nicer place in the morning. Some people might find a little bit g4 a little bit disagreeable, but let me just stress, that's a great move. Because the knight loses time, and we are just pushing him back. And furthermore, now that we've got this French structure, white's pawns are pointing towards the king, and he should be dreaming about mate. And also not just mate, but that is his side of the board. Okay, so with that in mind, let's think about what white should do. In the game, white plays queen b4. Paul in New Jersey asks, why didn't black play f6 at some point? He should have thought about it. There's a lot of things he should think about. Definitely not knight f. Definitely f6 would have been a better try than knight f5. Part of the drama for him, of course, is that the longer you wait to play a move like f6, the worse it's going to kind of get. In fact, let's honor Paul's intuition, because I think he's right. So if we go back here, in fact, instead of rook e8, and if you're going to play queen b7 anyway, maybe queen b7 just followed by f6. Yeah, more interesting. Okay. Absolutely. No, black just let it happen here. He just let it happen. And so, let's talk about queen b4 now. This is an important mistake. You will still be better after queen b4. Let's not get it wrong. You will still be better. But think about the two queens, just first of all. One is dramatically better than the other, right? So what you want to do here is, by the way, you're also losing time when you play queen b4, right? Very important that you're losing time. But the things we should focus on here is some kind of building move, and you've got several that are very appealing to me. Queen f4 looks right. Rook c1 looks right. And at some point, h4, h5. Absolutely right. You know, open him up. That's your side of the board. So any of those moves seem great to me as ways of turning the screw a little tighter on your beautiful space advantage. And let's talk about the nature here, because this helps us understand a lot of the past positions. The last two games we looked at is that these two pieces are poor. So remember, the heart of the space advantage is when you can make one or more of your opponent's pieces bad, right? Okay. Right. Queen b4. You still have the advantage here. a5. Probably correct. Bishop d2. I don't like it. I need you to be on top of that c5 square. Okay. Good move. Rook c7. A little bit weird. He needs to find a way to fix his knight and fix his bishop, right? So there's a variety of things he could do, but h6 intending g5 and knight g6 is certainly a start. I don't understand why we let him open the b file. Why not just b4? Now he's got an open rook. Now he's coming to life, right? Okay. I did not intend this, but what we have here, of course, is a little bit of a mirror image of what we had in the last game with Tim's game. All right, g5. Good move. That's the first move that he's made that I'm happy about. b4. Snip, snip. And now, honestly, this is an example of a position where I feel black is now fully okay. Let me turn off this business. White has one thread. It's b5. And a very typical thing that happens in the French is after everything is traded off, then there's all these weaknesses all of a sudden. And so if black would just play rook b7, he's doing all right. I don't know. I think I'd rather be black. My knight's will come to g6. I'm going to win the pawn on b4. What's not to like, right? What's not to like? Okay, so knight g6, b5. And I'm going to guess what he missed was that if c5 now, you have b6 followed by dc. So that probably was a rude awakening for your opponent. Knight f4, rook c6. Good. Now, my sense is that you thought this position was winning. And it might be, but I think it is closer than appearances might suggest, because the knight on f4 is now. He's out of the box, right? And you write that b6 was winning, and maybe that's what the computer says, and definitely looks good, but I just want to stress that there's still work to be done here. And maybe not knight f4 immediately, but the king gets to come over, and you are going to have to find a way to achieve rook c7. And there's a little bit of work to be done first. Okay, so rook c8, time pressure. I'm not sure about that. And now we're going to get a little dance. And white now agrees to a draw. And Bradley says it's winning. I wasn't so sure. Like, imagine here. Let's say, there's many ways to do this, but let's say check to the miserable king. Bishop, or king g7. Maybe check to the miserable king's no good. Let's do bishop f8. King h7. Bishop c5. Maybe I'm just with you. Maybe you are. Well, even this, though, at some point I have to worry about knight d3 and stuff. You know, yeah, it's still a little hectic. I just want to stress that. It's still a little bit hectic here. In any case, a draw was agreed, and should you have played king e1 to continue? Yeah. So that concludes the space portion of our show today. And like I said, what you should realize when you're playing with space or against space is that it's a very hard thing to pull off. And in particular, when we see a position like this where the knight gets out, suddenly the knight gets to attack this huge open area of squares that are behind the white position, and a lot of it has to do with the fact that white, by trading off a lot of pieces, gave up the capacity for him to hold all of that space. And that's a difficult concept, but we will return to it on other shows as well. Okay, we're going to move into our next segment. This is an odder segment, let's call it that. And we have two, let's call them Nakamura moves with queen rook 5. Rook 5 is the old notation. Many of you probably didn't grow up. Most of you probably didn't grow up with that. I was kind of in the middle between. You still had a lot of books with the old notation back when I was a kid, so that's how I learned how to do it. In any case, we're going to look at two early queen moves, and they kind of set the tone for the game, both games. So let's get into it. And we've got first this queen h4 move. So Scotch opening and queen h4. This is a move popularized by this GM named Lev Gutman, who I played at least once back in the day. And yeah, like I said, he wrote this book, and it's hard to believe, right? It's hard to believe. But like all these things, theory has developed, and at the very least, it's a difficult life for black, and shouldn't be recommended. For example, basically at some point, he can play knight b5, and then the king is going to have to do something ugly, like king d8. That's the gist of the problem for the guy. So, he will be scrambling in the pocket, as they say, once that knight b5 happens. Now, in this game, white plays knight c3. By the way, I'm happy to cover WMILTTI's game. I've seen him much on Twitter. His name is an acronym. Why must I lose to this idiot? And he's got a great Twitter feed, and I think he runs a blog as well, so an interesting guy. And he plays knight c3, which is fine, bishop b4, and bishop e2. And this was, I guess, maybe the extent of his opening knowledge, but it seems all totally fine to me. He writes that he was expecting queen e4, knight b5, and then, like I said, once you play queen h4, you're kind of all in for this weird position with king d8, which very much goes against what my mama told me about chess, right? This is not what she told me to do, but there's people who do this. Okay, so black says, I don't want to go down that road, and instead I'm going to play knight f6. This was an interesting moment, I think, for white. I want to say when I looked at it, I'm no expert or anything, I thought white's move was very ambitious, and I was not sure about it. I'm still not entirely sure. Again, I don't check this with the computer, and the reason is I want you to just see my human thoughts on the position. It's very easy for you to turn the computer on if you want. So I figure, why not just give you my thoughts? You can do the computer yourself if you like. In any case, my sense was that white was doing great after even just castles. Very simple move. Knight f5, of course, is the move which says I am going to punish black. And it's very frightening because What follows seems kind of sort of forced. Here we go. Queen e4. Check. Bishop h6. Now, it looks great for white. And of course, this is the kind of weird scrambling in the pocket stuff that Black dreamed of when he played Queen h4. And it's just a little nerve-wracking, for me anyways, to have this pieces a little bit hanging over there on the king's side. I looked at it a little bit, at least with human eyes. It seemed fine. It seemed fine to me. Now let's look at what happened. Queen g6, Queen d2, and that's also a little bit anti-intuitive because you are allowing knight e4, in which case I guess we're just going to play something like Queen e3. d5, Queen f4. Very nice move. Now white has a threat. I did not see anything great for what black should do here. So honestly, it looks like, just to my human eyes, that this was a fantastic refutation of the way that black played. I.e., he had to commit to that king d8 stuff if all of what white did here was correct. So d4, knight h5, king e7 looks forced, and then bam. And this is what you get. This is what you get when you play chess like this. Of course, if now Queen f6, there's the terrible bishop g5. And now it should be mate. He snaps a pawn first and then takes. And, you know, a lot of times on this show, I have criticized people who take the money and run, as it were. But this time, it seems totally fair. You've got the better king. You've got the pawns. Could you have done better? Probably. But this is end of the game. Yeah. Simple chess. Actually, we had a game that Tim, I believe, played ages ago when something like this happened. Actually, he ended up losing, so maybe I shouldn't say too much. It is possible, of course, still to blow the position. I'm just saying that for my own taste, going into this position seemed fine. Yeah, just grind him down. Grind this dude down. End it. Chess is sometimes an easy game, right? Simple and strong. Okay, might as well hang your queen if you're going to play on that long, right? So beautiful game. And so, you know, before the computers, people would say, don't bring your queen out early. One of my favorite scenes of Searching for Bobby Fischer is when Lawrence Fishburne is like, bring your queen out, Josh. Bring him out. Bring him out. Bring her out. That always stuck with me. And we're having that again, our second game, where Luca's opponent played this Queen h5 move, which is kind of an interesting history. It looks, of course, terrible. I believe it has to be not great. But Nakamura played this famously for a while in Blitz until he became tired of it. This was like in the early 2000s, mid-2000s, and back then, you know, Naka had an even bigger attitude. He had a real bad attitude, actually, back then. And he was kind of like wanting to show up people, you know? And so anyways, I think he had actually like studied a lot of these variations and found some tricky ideas, which especially in Blitz were demeaning to the people who lost against him. So this is the way it went. Knight f6, d3. I'm guessing, I don't know what Naka played here. Maybe c3 might be a move. In any case, I don't think knight d4 can be terrible. But I do think h6 should be terrible. Bishop g5 isn't going to crush you. You know, you can always kick the bishop away. And what's terrifying to me is that you're losing time, right? So, what this game is about, in a lot of ways, is the loss of time, in addition to being about Naka's Queen H5. And what you should see is, like, in the same way that someone could smirk when they see Queen H5, they should really smirk when you see H6, because bishop, yeah, the threat is greater than the execution, right? The threat of him putting the bishop on there is less than this H6 move, right? Which gives him a full tempo. Knight of 3 is a little weird. It seems like he's obsessed with putting the queen there. C3 would give white, I think, a pretty normalish looking roue position. By the way, what should you have played? I think there's more than one move, but a simple one I really like is just b5. And now the knight will never have to leave. The only way it's going to leave d4 is probably taking a bishop. Okay. Yeah. So here we go. Bishop g7. Good, simple and strong. And now another funny move, king h7. So again, you are responding to a psychological thing of the bishop touching your king. He's a long way away, though, and, I would like the option of taking back, too, with the c-pawn. So just a very simple move, rook e8, I think gives you a small advantage. Yeah, small advantage. King h7. And now white commits a crime, f4. Now there's a couple ways to think about this crime. In general, imagine if black had committed d4, which under no circumstance should he ever do. Then f4 is going to make a lot more sense. And what we'll have, if you actually did play d4, we would have a King's Indian on crack for white, because his bad bishop, which is normally here, would be on b3, and it would just be amazing. But the reason you don't generally want to play f4 is because precisely what happened. Now the center gets ripped open, and the center is not yet locked. It is fluid, right? So the grief here is A, that, but B, white is opening the position before he's fixed his junk, right? All this stuff is like undeveloped. Fix your junk before you move it. It's that simple. Okay, EF, E5. Let's think about E5 for a second. I don't like it because it kills the bishop on B3, right? The bishop had a little tension with the D5 pawn, and now it's gone. Furthermore, he's encouraging you to do a great thing, and that's to put your knight on G4 whenever you want, right? Now, if you wanted to be simplistic about this position, I'm sure you could have played knight G4, knight G4 instead of rook E8. But what you did was fine. D4. And now the next move I want to focus in on a little bit. You should definitely be winning this position, but you should give, it's bishop G4 that you should give a question mark to, and you write pressuring D4 now. Think about white's position for a second. This guy must get back. He's got to get back. And that's pretty much the only way he's going to do it. So when you're saying pressuring D4, well, he wants to play C3. He has to, for the sake of his bishop. So, first of all, I think you're winning here. It's not just the pawn, but the fact that your development is better. And like a lot of King's Gambit positions, this guy is blunted. So just the simple and strong bishop F5, it's got to be better than bishop G4. So this is an example of loss of time. And now I still like your position, but things are getting creaky. Knight D2. And here I'm going to say you definitely make the wrong discovery move. You play here. And this is going to have everything to do with helping white open your position up. The simplest is, well, it would be great if you could play knight c3, but you can't because that's a check. But if you just wanted to get out of there, then knight d6 is a plausible move. I'm lying. I just realized that's not right either. I'm beginning to have sympathy for your situation. All right? I'm beginning to have sympathy. So, in this position, arguably, he's already done himself a big favor here. Yeah, he's done himself a big favor and had everything to do with that tempo. So, your move, knight g3, honestly, it doesn't help things. But it was no longer totally simple in a kind of surprising way, really, for us to play this position. Surprising to me anyways, but it has everything to do with the fact that your queen is outside of the bounds and this guy's unprotected. So knight d2 was in fact great. I didn't understand at first that, I just thought the knight g3 was a mistake. I didn't understand you were already in trouble. Now, bishop g6, some terrible thing like that, it's already bad news. Maybe, let's try to figure this out actually. Maybe f6 is what you need to try. Let's just look for a second. Snip, 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 here. It's at least interesting. Yeah, that's at least more interesting for you. Yeah, I think you're still on top. So, yeah, and it would just surprise us if the guy, after knight d2, really had anything. This, by the way, is indicative of the kind of player who will play queen h5, is they just have no respect for their business. Kind of like King's Gambit players do. But look, what you do here is you enable the dream of the King's Gambit. Let's talk about the dream of Federico just for a second. We've done so on the show. The rook, when they play f4, they want the rook out. They should want the rook out, and they should want the extension of the bishop's scope on this diagonal. And so when you play knight g3, you are enabling both of those things. And now I'm afraid for your life. Right? He's doing great. Whole mess. Whole mess. I went by that too fast. Sometimes I do that. Sometimes I do that. As you noted, this rook e5 is not actually going to work because of something like this. And like a lot of these things, we get to cover our business both with gf or queen e5. But before we criticize that tactically, we should note that even though I don't like White's last couple moves that much, you are suffering now because of his better pieces and the rook on the f file. So that looks like a blow it. And now things start to go downhill for the guy. Rook e8, good move. The rook has grief, and yeah, you're in charge now. Maybe there was better than queen f6, but that didn't help him. And now things are all the way gone. So, an interesting game that has everything to do, like most things, with time. I did a video I liked arising out of this this show last month, and it was why the most common mistake in chess, and it applies mostly to class players, but also above 2000, and that is that people give away time. They know not to give away material, but they don't know not to give away time. And part of becoming a stronger player is both sensing that in your own moves and realizing that most of the players you're going to play against, that is their key mistake, and taking advantage of that mistake is central to you winning games. Okay, let's look at a very interesting game that Ayush played. This was a Marshall, and I'm going to call this the original Marshall because my historical understanding is that this variation was the first way that the Marshall was played, namely knight f6. Nowadays, of course, you have c6. And c6 is a very clever move in that it blocks the bishop. and keeps the knight there. But, you know, if you're just looking at this with human eyes, then clearly, if you're going to play this gambit, knight f6 makes a lot of sense to attack white's structure before he can do anything about it. And this game, clear example of the value of the initiative. All right. Now, I didn't look this up, but you can imagine that this has been played numerous times by numerous people. Right. Is bishop h2 playable? Maybe. That might be playable. Bishop b7, bishop g5, c5. So, very simple position. And now I want you to see, I think you submitted this game, Ayush, because you sensed that, like, oh man, something terribly wrong happened here. And a lot of it has to do with the next couple moves. So what you did was, I think your narrative was, well, I have got this extra pawn, and I want to keep that extra pawn, and so let's go ahead and snip snop over there. You should, I think, be looking at creative ways of getting rid of the pawn, or giving it back, rather. And so knight d2 is the first thing you should be thinking about. And again, knight d2 here you should think about. And something obvious to see is that, and a lot of people don't actually appreciate this, is when you trade queens like this, you gave black a very important tempo. And so, at the very least, I think, black is equal. At least. Let's see what happened. We got a great note. If I recall, this was Capablanca, Marshall, and Capa had to figure it out on the fly. That sounds right to me. It's definitely like a classic game, and this is the original conception with the Marshall Gambit. So white played bishop d4, snip, snip, and white is just on the edge here of death. He's right on the edge here of death. And let's put this rook d8. White needs to say pronto, oh no, I am in trouble. And so let's talk about the initiative for a second. Obviously, black has the rook on the 7th. That's a big deal. It's also a big deal that the pawn is already on h6, so white owes us a move with doing something with his king. And with all that said, I still think white should be able to hold this position, but he needs to conceive of it as precisely that. He's just holding. He's not doing more than that. So, right. So, I think we need to think about rook ad1, and then a position might occur like this. Snip, 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 rook e7, and we could imagine bishop d5, and maybe even, again, this square is covered, maybe even a hint of trickiness now with rook d7. And maybe we have proven ourselves, a valid tactician here. Anyways, that would at least give white something to aim for in this position. Right, where it suddenly looks like maybe we shouldn't have enough for an advantage. And for example, this kind of shows it, just the simple rook b2. We'll move the thing later. White will win this, though, and he shouldn't be worse. For example, now f3, and yeah, the game goes on. The game goes on. I guess, yeah, we could claim we like white better here. Sure, no problem. So I think here is that you needed to, part of it, and this happens a lot when people are up a pawn, is they need to dampen their expectations when they're down time like this. So bishop d5, now it's going to become hard to challenge on the d file, challenge that big fat rook on d2. Oh, and I said, what was it was it Paul's game that f3 was played? No, it wasn't Paul's game. I'm getting it all mixed up. We had a game earlier where f3 was played, and the thing actually that I should have said then. Yeah, whatever. Might have put in different words, but the cool concept that you can see visibly here a little bit more clearly is that you giving black what Nimzovich called the absolute seventh rank. Let me just talk about that briefly. The conception is that the rook, obviously great on the seventh rank, but at the moment he really has only got that much scope. And intuitively, white could say to himself something like, oh, I should move my pawns all the way off so that the guy doesn't have scope. Well, the problem with that is when you play f3, you're giving scope. And we're going to see the results of that coming up real quick here. So rook b2, we're really close to losing here. And rook a7 isn't going to do it because now I think it's over. It's hard for me to imagine this not being over. One cool thing, if you imagine having the f-pawn here, is when the rooks do come down, I can at least come over and play rook f1. That is now not going to be an option, and this is now totally, totally lost. We've seen this movie before, right? And there's no counterplay. The pawns are all falling. So a very instructive endgame there. And like I said, one of the key actually developments in a chess player's life is to realize that you can sack a pawn in the endgame, that the initiative continues in the endgame. And the reason it's kind of interesting is you need to know what it would mean to have the initiative. And doubled rooks on the 7th is definitely an example of that. We saw earlier in Paul's game he had the potential of connected passed pawns in the endgame. That's also an example of something you could sacrifice for. And of course, time is something you can sacrifice for. Okay, let's look at our final game. This is Ricker. And Ricker has been on this show a bunch. And let me just show briefly our list of games here. Ricker's been on the show a bunch, and I think he's done really remarkably well to improve. Let me just say I'm an old guy myself, and I have struggled with my own chess improvement. I do a show once a week called The Road Back to 2500, mostly to keep myself in line. And so what I'm trying to say is I know how hard it is to improve when you're older. A lot of times you can just get stuck. Even going back to where I was is its own special problem. And I've coached a lot of older guys as well. And I know just from that experience of coaching that it can be very difficult to make progress. Okay, Ricker, though, is in his 70s. He's crushing it, man. Check this out. When he came first on this show, he was just hanging pieces left and right. And even though g5 is objectively a terrible move, the thing about the Grob is that now at least there's dreams of this diagonal being weak. So it's not it's not as dumb as it might look. And what I like about Ricker's play here, he's just fundamentally solid. And I'm not a great fan of this move, but it just completely solidifies his position. Yeah, absolutely. And now here's an instructive mistake from his opponent, knight c6. I think if you're going to play this way, you've got to tell yourself that this bishop needs life. And so either now or on the next move, play c5 and just accept whatever comes. Now the c-pawn isn't going to fight for the center. Very simple and strong. And on the surface, it seems like white's given up something here. But he's still got a tremendous position. And It's here that black commits a positional sin, and I like very much the way Ricker exploits it. Let's say a couple obvious things. We've got unopposed bishops, and we've got opposite sides castling. And the takeaway, or the thing you should be aware of when you get a situation like that, is that the initiative will count for more, for two reasons. One, the opposite sides castling means that whoever starts attacking first is going to get closer to the king. But also, with opposite color bishops, whoever is able to create an initiative on the color of their bishop, in this case white has the white square and black has the black square bishop, on those squares it'll be like he's up a piece on those squares, and that makes the initiative more important with the opposite color bishops. So right now black must, I repeat, must fight for the dark squares, and a move like e5 might allow him to hold on to the game. Instead, what we're seeing here is queen h5 with just, let's call it superficial intentions of aggression, and now f4, very nice move, shutting down the e5 square and enabling the light square bishop to do its work on the light squares. So now with that one shift of seemingly innocuous attacking seeming move, queen h5, black's gone from being in the game to, I think, out. I think it's really over. Notice how those pawns on dark squares really form a rock against the black minors. Check to the miserable king, queen f3. Very simple and strong, right? Very simple and strong. The queen will make sure nothing happens to her man, gets off of the d file, and starts looking at our light squares here. Yeah, that should be our dream already. So queen h6, do I know? But I don't, but I also don't know what he should do. Rook a d1. Mild criticism here, Ricker. I want you to put your business on the C file, and I want you to start thinking about rerouting this dude to this diagonal here. If you wanted to be really fancy, you could even go like that now. But just putting your rook first on the C file definitely makes sense. So e6, rook g3, okay, fine. And I really like your next move here. By the way, it's only in hindsight sometimes you can understand these moves. Like, I didn't understand queen h6, but I guess this was his intention the whole time. And a very nice move by Ricker. Look at this. Boop. Simple moves. We're in no rush. We put the pawns in the dark squares. Why? Because we can't control the dark squares with our minors as easily as black can. So we want to use our pawns to make a wall on that color. And, simple enough, we're taking away any kind of potential counterplay. Knight e5, simple and strong. I guess I would have wanted you to first reroute the bishop, like bishop h3, g2, before you did knight e5. But this is great. Do I understand why he let you rip open the light squares there? No, I don't. You could have played hg there too, but it's fine. Rook c1, that's where he belonged. And here, Ricker, definitely bishop g2. g2, that's where the bishop wants to go. But you are definitely winning this position. And I'm hope that the way we've talked about this kind of position, the opposite color bishops, informed how you played this position. Because by all means, we're looking at those light squares right now. c5, opening all the light squares, but it's hard to give the guy advice, right? D takes, rook takes. Now, let me criticize this move. Rook takes. No, no, Ricker. No. I guess maybe you said if you play rook d1, there's some kind of queen c6 thing. I guess I can kind of see that. In which case, we shouldn't play dc. That's we can play bishop c4, for example, is probably the cleanest way to go about this. But okay, let's look. Bishop a6, I still like bishop g2. e4, good move. Check to the miserable king. Snip. Check. And I think you're winning. Do I know for sure? I don't know. But the point is, even in this ending, your attack on the light squares is going to continue, and your king is comforted by the fact that it's snug here because your pawns are doing all the dark square work and your bishop's doing the light square work. So a conceptually winning position as far as I can tell. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. And a beautiful victory. So let me just say, when we track Ricker's progress over the years here, is that in a way you could use it as a model for beginning players as well. And that is, at first, the challenge for Ricker was mastering the first dimension of the game, which is material. And everybody has to go through it. They drop pieces left and right. They have to master not dropping stuff. Ricker's gotten a lot better at it, right? That level of the game. The next level, time. A little bit harder to understand because you have to ask yourself, time for what? Ricker is not giving away nearly as much time. And yeah, once you get it conceptually, it's not that hard of a thing to understand. And I'm hoping that me yelling at people like the way I yelled at Say Chess last month encourages, having that in the back of your mind that I'm going to yell at you if you lose time will help you master that second dimension of the game. And the third, of course, is the most complicated. We usually call that quality of position, right? You could talk there about king security, but also very dynamic things like how to use the opposite color bishops. Why in the endgame with Paul that the connected pass pawns were really, the potential of connected pass pawns were such a big thing. So I'm going to end it there. Thank you very much for being here. We will be here next month, and I want to say that we will have a forum up in the next couple of days. If you go to chess.com and just type in my name, you will find the forum where, if you want, you can submit a game. I promise to be nice. I promise to be nice. I was a little bit mean to Say Chess last month, but so far, I don't intend to be mean, first of all, but people have been good sports about the times that I have been mean. And, it takes a little bit of courage, of course, to submit a game that you've played, especially one where maybe you didn't play the best moves. And honestly, for most people, that's everything. And even for GMs, most games that you play against opposition that is around your own level, that is presenting you problems, it's very rare to have a perfect game. And arguably, why must I lose to this idiot? WMITTLI. His game might have been perfect. That was an example of a game that might have been perfect. Okay. I'll leave it there. I'll see you next month. Bye-bye.